Welcome to Lumenara. Today we continue our journey through the book of Genesis as we explore chapters 15 through 25. In these chapters, we follow Abraham through some of the most important and challenging moments of his life. We witness God reaffirming his covenant and promises, the birth of Ishmael, the promise of Isaac, and the transformation of Abram and Sarai into Abraham and Sarah. We also encounter some of the most powerful stories in Genesis. We see Abraham intercede for the people of Sodom, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, the miraculous birth of Isaac, and one of the greatest tests of faith recorded in Scripture, when God commands Abraham to offer his beloved son. As the story continues, we follow Isaac's marriage to Rebekah, the final years of Abraham's life, and the beginning of the next generation through Esau and Jacob. These chapters reveal that God's promises do not always unfold according to human expectations or timing. Abraham's journey is filled with moments of faith, doubt, obedience, waiting, and testing. Yet through every season, God remains faithful to his covenant. As we explore Genesis chapters 15 through 25, we'll follow these events in chronological order and discover how each chapter builds upon God's unfolding plan. Whether you're continuing your study of Genesis or hearing these stories for the first time, may this summary deepen your understanding of God's Word and encourage you to trust His promises, even when the path ahead is uncertain. Now, let's begin with God's covenant with Abraham. Genesis chapter 15 begins with God speaking to Abram in a vision and reassuring him not to be afraid. Abram had no child of his own and wondered how God's promises could be fulfilled through his family. He questioned whether his servant Eliezer might become his heir. But God told Abram that his heir would come from his own body and that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. Abram believed the Lord, and his faith was counted to him as righteousness. God then reminded him that he had brought him out of Ur to give him the land of Canaan. When Abram asked how he could know that he would possess it, God established a covenant with him through a solemn ceremony involving several animals. As the sun went down, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and God revealed that his descendants would one day become strangers in a foreign land, where they would suffer for generations. But God promised that he would bring them out with great possessions and return them to the land he had promised. Chapter 16 introduces Hagar, Sarai's Egyptian servant. Because Sarai had not yet given Abram a child, she gave Hagar to Abram so that she might have a child through her. Hagar conceived, but tension soon grew between her and Sarai. Feeling mistreated, Hagar fled into the wilderness. There, an angel of the Lord found Hagar beside a spring and told her to return to Sarai. He promised that her descendants would become too numerous to count. The angel also revealed that she would have a son and that she should name him Ishmael, because the Lord had heard her suffering. Hagar returned and gave birth to Ishmael when Abram was 86 years old. Genesis chapter 17 marks another major moment in God's covenant with Abram. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and called him to walk faithfully before him. God changed his name from Abram to Abraham, declaring that he would become the father of many nations. God also changed Sarai's name to Sarah and promised that she would become the mother of nations and that kings would come from her. As a sign of the covenant, God established circumcision for Abraham and every male in his household. This covenant would continue through Abraham's descendants as a lasting sign of their relationship with God. Yet Abraham still wondered about Ishmael. God assured him that Ishmael would be blessed and would become the father of 12 rulers. But God made it clear that his covenant would be established through the son that Sarah would bear. God then revealed the promise that Sarah would have a son, even though she was already advanced in age. Abraham would name him Isaac, and God promised to establish his covenant with Isaac and his descendants after him. Abraham obeyed God's command that very day. He and the men of his household were circumcised, marking the beginning of a new stage in the covenant relationship between God and Abraham. Through Genesis chapters 15 through 17, we see God's promises becoming clearer. Abraham learns that God's plan will be fulfilled through a son of his own, and despite years of waiting and uncertainty, God remains faithful to his word. Genesis chapter 18 begins with Abraham sitting near his tent when 3 visitors appeared before him. Abraham welcomed them with great hospitality, offering them food, water, and a place to rest. During their visit, one of the visitors announced that Sarah would have a son within a year. Sarah was listening from inside the tent, and because she was already advanced in age, she laughed to herself at the thought of having a child. But the Lord asked Abraham why Sarah had laughed and reminded him that nothing was too difficult for God. After the visitors departed, the Lord revealed to Abraham that he was going to judge the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah because of their great wickedness. Abraham then stood before the Lord and boldly interceded for the people living there. He asked whether God would destroy the righteous along with the wicked. Abraham pleaded with God, asking if the cities would be spared if 50 righteous people were found there. He continued asking, lowering the number to 45, 40, 30, 20, and finally 10. Each time, the Lord promised that he would spare the cities if that many righteous people were found. After this conversation, the Lord went on his way, and Abraham returned to his place. Genesis chapter 19 begins with 2 angels arriving in Sodom. Lot was sitting at the city gate, and when he saw them, he welcomed them into his home. He urged them to stay for the night, but before they could settle down, the men of Sodom surrounded the house and demanded that Lot bring his visitors outside. The angels protected Lot and struck the men with blindness. They then warned Lot that the city would soon be destroyed and instructed him to gather his family and leave immediately. Lot hesitated, so the angels took him, his wife, and his 2 daughters by the hand and led them out of the city. They warned them not to look back and to escape to the mountains. As Lot and his family fled, the Lord rained down burning sulfur upon Sodom and Gomorrah, destroying the cities and the surrounding land. But Lot's wife looked back and became a pillar of salt. The next morning, Abraham looked toward the cities and saw smoke rising from the land, like smoke from a furnace. Yet God remembered Abraham and rescued Lot from the destruction. Later, Lot and his daughters lived in a cave in the mountains. His daughters believed that there were no men left to marry them, and they devised a plan to have children through their father. Both daughters became pregnant, and their sons became the ancestors of the Moabites and the Ammonites. Genesis chapter 20 then describes Abraham's journey to the region of Gerar. Once again, Abraham said that Sarah was his sister, fearing that the people of the land might kill him because of her. Abimelech, king of Gerar, took Sarah into his household. But God appeared to Abimelech in a dream and warned him that Sarah was Abraham's wife. Abimelech confronted Abraham and returned Sarah to him. Abraham explained his fear and revealed that Sarah was indeed his half-sister as well as his wife. Abraham then prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, his wife, and the women of his household so that they could have children again. These chapters reveal both God's justice and his mercy. Abraham's intercession shows his concern for the righteous, while the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah demonstrates the seriousness of wickedness. At the same time, God continued to protect Lot and preserve his promise to Abraham and Sarah. Genesis chapter 21 marks the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham and Sarah. The Lord visited Sarah as he had promised, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son in her old age. Abraham named the child Isaac, according to God's command. When Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God had commanded. Sarah was filled with joy and declared that God had given her laughter, and everyone who heard about it would rejoice with her. As Isaac grew, Abraham held a great celebration on the day Isaac was weaned. But Sarah noticed Ishmael, the son of Hagar, mocking Isaac. She became concerned that Ishmael might share in Isaac's inheritance and asked Abraham to send Hagar and her son away. Abraham was deeply troubled by this request, but God told him to listen to Sarah and reassured him that Ishmael would also become a great nation because he was Abraham's son. The next morning, Abraham gave Hagar bread and water and sent her and Ishmael into the wilderness of Beersheba. When their water was gone, Hagar placed Ishmael under a bush and moved away, unable to watch him die. But God heard the boy crying. An angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and told her not to be afraid. God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water nearby. She filled the container and gave Ishmael water. God remained with Ishmael as he grew, and he became an expert archer and lived in the wilderness of Paran. Later, Abraham made a covenant with Abimelech at Beersheba. Abraham established his ownership of a well of water and planted a tamarisk tree there, calling upon the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. Genesis chapter 22 brings one of the greatest tests of Abraham's faith. God called Abraham and commanded him to take Isaac, his beloved son, to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering. This was the son through whom God had promised to establish Abraham's covenant. Early the next morning, Abraham prepared the wood, took Isaac and 2 servants, and began the journey. After traveling for 3 days, Abraham saw the place in the distance. He told his servants to remain behind while he and Isaac went to worship. Isaac carried the wood, while Abraham carried the fire and the knife. As they walked, Isaac asked where the lamb for the offering was. Abraham answered that God himself would provide the lamb. When they reached the place, Abraham built an altar and arranged the wood. He bound Isaac and placed him upon the altar. Just as Abraham reached out his hand to take the knife, the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and told him not to harm the boy. The angel declared that Abraham had demonstrated his fear of God because he was willing to give his only son. Abraham then looked up and saw a ram caught by its horns in a nearby thicket. He took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering instead of his son. Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." The Lord then reaffirmed his covenant with Abraham, promising that his descendants would become as numerous as the stars of heaven and the sand on the seashore. He also promised that through Abraham's offspring, all nations of the earth would be blessed because Abraham had obeyed his voice. Genesis chapter 23 records the death of Sarah. Sarah lived to be 127 years old and died in Hebron, in the land of Canaan. Abraham mourned for her and sought a place where he could bury her. He approached the sons of Heth and asked to purchase a burial place. They offered Abraham a choice of their tombs, but Abraham insisted on paying the full price for the field and the cave of Machpelah, which belonged to Ephron. The land was officially transferred to Abraham as a permanent burial place. There, Abraham buried Sarah, marking the first recorded piece of land that Abraham personally possessed in the land God had promised to his descendants. Through Genesis chapters 21 through 23, we witness the fulfillment of God's promise through Isaac, the preservation of Ishmael, the greatest test of Abraham's faith, and the death of Sarah. Through every moment, God's promises continue to move forward. Genesis chapter 24 begins with Abraham now advanced in age. He wanted to make sure that his son Isaac would not marry a woman from the Canaanites, so he called his oldest servant and gave him an important responsibility. The servant was instructed to travel to Abraham's homeland and find a suitable wife for Isaac from among Abraham's relatives. The servant took camels and provisions and began his journey. When he reached the city, he stopped near a well in the evening when women would come to draw water. He prayed to God for guidance, asking for a sign. He asked that the young woman chosen by God would offer him water and also willingly offer water to his camels. Before he had finished praying, Rebekah appeared carrying a water jar. She gave the servant water and then offered to draw enough water for all his camels. Her kindness and willingness immediately confirmed to the servant that God had answered his prayer. The servant gave Rebekah jewelry and asked about her family. He soon discovered that she was the granddaughter of Nahor, Abraham's brother. Rebekah invited him to her family's home, where the servant explained why he had come and described Abraham's wealth, God's promises, and his mission to find a wife for Isaac. Rebekah's family agreed that this was clearly the Lord's doing. When they asked Rebekah whether she was willing to go with the servant, she agreed. She left her family and traveled toward Canaan. As they approached the land, Isaac was walking in the fields when he saw the camels approaching. Rebekah also saw Isaac and covered herself with a veil. The servant explained everything that had happened, and Isaac took Rebekah as his wife. The Bible tells us that Isaac loved Rebekah, and her presence brought him comfort after the death of his mother, Sarah. Genesis chapter 25 describes the final years of Abraham's life. Abraham took another wife, Keturah, and she bore him several sons. These sons became the ancestors of different peoples and nations. Abraham gave everything he owned to Isaac, but he also gave gifts to the sons of his other wives and sent them away toward the lands of the east. This made clear that Isaac was the son through whom God's covenant would continue. Abraham lived to be 175 years old. He died at an advanced age and was gathered to his people. His sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him beside Sarah in the cave of Machpelah, the burial place Abraham had purchased. The chapter then turns toward the next generation. Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, but Rebekah was unable to have children. Isaac prayed to the Lord on her behalf, and the Lord answered his prayer. Rebekah became pregnant with twins. The children struggled within her, and she asked the Lord why this was happening. God told her that 2 nations were in her womb, and that the older would serve the younger. When the time came for her to give birth, the first son came out red and covered with hair, so they named him Esau. His brother came out holding Esau's heel, and he was named Jacob. Esau became a skilled hunter and a man of the open country, while Jacob was quiet and preferred to remain among the tents. Isaac loved Esau because he enjoyed eating the game Esau brought home, while Rebekah loved Jacob. One day, Jacob was cooking stew when Esau returned from the field, exhausted, and asked for some food. Jacob offered him the stew in exchange for his birthright. Esau, thinking only of his immediate hunger, agreed and sold his birthright to Jacob for a meal. The chapter concludes by emphasizing how lightly Esau regarded his birthright. This moment would become an important part of the story of Jacob and the fulfillment of God's purposes through the next generation. Through Genesis chapters 24 and 25, we see the transition from Abraham's generation to Isaac's. God provides Rebekah as Isaac's wife. Abraham's life comes to an end, and the story begins to focus on Jacob and Esau, whose lives will shape the next chapter of God's unfolding plan. As we conclude our journey through Genesis chapters 15 through 25, we have witnessed some of the most important moments in Abraham's story and in the unfolding of God's covenant. We saw God make his promises to Abraham, even when their fulfillment seemed impossible. We witnessed the birth of Ishmael, the miraculous birth of Isaac, and the establishment of God's covenant through Abraham and his descendants. We also saw Abraham intercede for Sodom, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and God's mercy in rescuing Lot. Then came one of the greatest tests of Abraham's faith, when he was willing to offer Isaac, trusting that God would remain faithful to his promise. As Abraham's life came to an end, the story moved forward to the next generation. Isaac received Rebekah as his wife, and through them came Esau and Jacob. beginning a new chapter in God's unfolding plan. These chapters remind us that faith is not simply believing when everything is easy. Abraham's journey was filled with waiting, uncertainty, difficult choices, and moments of testing. Yet through every season, God remained faithful to His word. The promises made to Abraham would continue through Isaac, Jacob, and generations yet to come. What began with one man's obedience would become part of a story that would ultimately reach far beyond his own lifetime. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Genesis chapters 15 through 25. If this Bible study helped you understand God's Word more deeply, we invite you to continue exploring the Scriptures with us here on Lumenara. May the Lord strengthen your faith, guide your steps, and remind you that His promises remain faithful even when the fulfillment takes time. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next Bible study.